Imagine being out to dinner one evening and a job recruiter, perhaps accompanied by a few large, burly men, offers you a job that you don't want with low pay. And guess what? You can't say no. If this had happened to you in the 18th century, you would now be a member of the British Royal Navy and about to set off to sea. Today we're talking with Denver Brunsman about press gangs, impressment, and quite possibly the worst way to get a new job. This is Too Complicated for History. Today we have as our guest Dr. Denver Brunsman, a history professor from George Washington University. Thanks so much for being here with us, Denver.
It's great, Lynn. Thanks for having me.
So I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about your research and what exactly you're focused on and interested in, and why you chose that.
We want to know what you've been studying, matey.
Absolutely. So I study British naval impressment. And, as I tell people, I study like the process in which people get hit on the head in a bar and end up in a Royal Naval vessel. So, it's a really fascinating topic, and it feels quite foreign sometimes, but it really takes you back to the 18th century when, navies needed men and they would find any way possible to get them. And so this took place, across the Atlantic, in the Caribbean, in North America, in the British Isles. So kind of my intellectual curiosity and my love for travel and all these different things come together with this topic.
Fantastic. I think one of the first things I want to do is you use different terms in your research. So we're going to be throwing around terms. So I want to make sure that you define them for us because I know what I think they are, but I could be wrong. Privateers. And then, of course, pirates, and then press gangs. So
yeah,
to me, these are all kind of similar, but I'm not really sure how you define them. So what are these people?
Yeah, they're all, somewhat related, and they're all part of this maritime world of the Atlantic. So let's start with press gangs, since that's my main focus. So press gangs were part of the Navy, and this was basically a group of men, maybe around 10 to 12 at most. It could be, as few as 4 or 5, usually headed by a naval lieutenant. And they would operate both at sea and on land. And they're looking for recruits. They're looking for, prime subjects to sail in the Royal Navy. So this is a state-sponsored conscription, and you might say kidnapping. So
these are the ones in the bars hitting people.
Yes, okay. And that doesn't happen too often, but there's cases, right? So that's press gangs, and privateers and pirates are very close together. So pirates, these are folks who are operating on the private side of things, so they're not part of the state. They're not, part of the government in any way. And, they're stealing stuff. They're stopping ships at sea, and they're taking over ships, and they're forcing some of those people on board the ships into their ships. So, they're practicing impressment, a different form of it. But, by the 18th century, these activities are illegal. And, if you've seen your Pirates of the Caribbean, you know that the Royal Navy is going around trying to capture these different pirates. Now, privateers, you can kind of think about as legal piracy. This is the state, the nation, whether it was, Great Britain or France or even the early United States, giving a document called a letter of marque to a ship captain. And that basically authorized him to become a pirate. And he would, make war and try to steal stuff from the enemy. So, in the early modern era, in the 1500s, leading into the 1600s, England, used pirates and really kind of invented privateering in a way by essentially sanctioning these pirates to attack the enemy. So all these different folks are roaming around the seas in the 17th and 18th centuries.
I've been trying to think of a pirate speak way to interject into that conversation, and it was just too slow. So I'm just going to drop the voice.
You can just drop an R.
Yeah. So privateers are a little like contractors, right? They're being paid by the government to go do a job.
Absolutely, kind of outsourced, and they kind of make their money. You might say, their analogy to today through royalties. They're making their money through what they capture. They get to keep a share, and the government gets to keep a share, and it gets distributed in different ways. That highly favors the officers, and so I think that's one appeal of piracy, is that it was more democratic in sort of the division of the loot. And so a sailor who's kind of facing these choices, what do I do? What am I going to do in this war? Am I going to go with the regular Navy? Am I going to go with the privateers? Or am I just going to go all pirate? I think they had to factor in all of these things.
So so I know very little outside of the movies, being completely honest about this era and this particular
you
subject.
And a lot of people.
Yeah, right. I don't think I'm alone in that. Could you give me a little bit of timeline? Because you talked about the British Navy specifically, but as far as like what the timeline of and how they invented privateering. So were they for hundreds of years, the dominant power in the ocean? Had other nations, other countries tried different methodologies for, trying to tame the seas, as it were?
Yeah, so the English are kind of underdogs in the early modern period, and that's one reason they resorted to piracy. So they're a fairly backward nation in the 1500s and into the early 1600s, which is often called the Elizabethan era, and in fact Elizabeth I is the person who sanctions these pirates, these folks that were called her sea dogs, people like Sir Francis Drake, to make war on the Spanish, who really were the dominant imperial power at the time. We can think about, Columbus sailing for the Spanish, and the Spanish kind of getting first to the New World, and they discover lots and lots of silver and gold, and so they're bringing those ships back, and those ships were the targets for these early, pirate / privateers, and so that's kind of the early period, and you go forward into the 1600s, and what happened is that England eventually gets enough wealth that they decide to make their own navy, not just to outsource everything to these privateers. And so as the modern state begins to build and they have their own navy, these people that they had previously empowered to make war on other nations all of a sudden start to target their own ships. Pirates don't always discriminate, right? So they start targeting English ships, and at that point they become a problem. And that's when you get the Pirates of the Caribbean dynamic in terms of the Navy versus pirates. And as the Navy grows and they begin having more and more wars, especially with France, they just needed lots and lots of men to fill these ships, and that's why the practice of impressment really explodes in the 1700s.
So it sounds like you're talking about like a centuries old struggle for the state to control a part of the world or an area that is just inherently difficult to do so. Right, that's
absolutely
kind of like all these,
okay, yeah. I mean, we think about this. The sea is in some ways kind of boundless, right? It doesn't have all the natural boundaries of the land, and so to try to lay some kind of claim to that space, to nationalize it in a sense, is what England was really trying to do, and they have different rivals. I mentioned France and Spain. The Dutch are a huge rival because they become a shipping power in the 17th century and have their own colonies. And there's a phrase that's used with all the wealth that the Dutch had, is there was an embarrassment of riches. The English they went in on that as well, and the Dutch so dominated shipping at one point that English sailors learned the names of the different parts of the ship by the Dutch name. They actually didn't even know the English name. And, this becomes a real problem for England. And that's one reason they passed a bunch of laws in the mid 1600s called the Navigation Acts, which require their ships to be manned by English-speaking sailors. So there really is this big attempt to control the seas. Yeah, maybe and an analogy today might be space, right? We'll see what happens, but it's kind of like that, kind of like the race to control this.
I was thinking of other historical places where like the state power is difficult to exert in those spaces, like the American West in the latter half of the 19th century, or any of the colonial era, like places like the Amazon jungle and sort of the Portuguese Empire, but like there's these spaces that are difficult to exert state power, difficult to make things safe and develop systems that make it like, hey, these are our trade routes. This makes it so that we can economically exploit this area, or people can traverse safely or whatever. But this is an interesting version of that because we don't have that experience with the oceans nowadays, outside of like a few particular pockets. That I'm just remembering, but maybe 10 years ago, there was a big thing with Somali pirates off the African coast for a little while. But besides piracy is like more. Yeah, there you go.
That's right.
Yeah, usually I'm the movie reference guy.
Captain Phillips, Tom Hanks.
Yeah. And
Lynn's the captain now.
Even from them, we can kind of learn a little bit about this story, because you think about it, that people resort to piracy and those types of, lawless actions at a weakness that they're not able to exert their power otherwise. And so, that's kind of how England gets started. And in some ways, that's how the United States, get started. They use lots of privateers in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. And England, which kind of created this model, this formula, disparages the early U.S. endlessly for this type of piracy.
So what kind of things are they stealing? I'm sorry, Isaac. I have this vision in my head of them having their arms full of gold bars, and I know that probably isn't true, but I want it to be. So what are they? What are these, pirates and privateers?
Not bars, doubloons.
What were they stealing? And, what? Because to me, gold bars, okay, that's worth something anywhere. But taking barrels of tobacco, I just don't see that as being.
Yeah, it doesn't seem that great, does it?
No.
Yeah. So in the late 1500s, early 1600s, that was that kind of classic age where someone really could capture one of these Spanish galleons and make it rich. So maybe not gold bars, but gold for sure. And then
Jewels.
I think after that, it really is any attempt, especially in times of war, to disrupt commerce and any type of material wealth. So, we're kind of joking about tobacco, but that actually happened where French privateers would stop English tobacco ships. And England in particular is really dependent on trade for its wealth. It really needed all of that to continue even during wartime.
Right.
So that would be one way, I think, for Britain's enemies to really get at it. Whether it was sugar, tobacco, and the various things, and then the ships themselves. These take years to build. These really giant sailing ships. And one thing I love in my research is you find a ship that has been captured multiple times, and the name just keeps changing back and forth between like an English and a French name. You just kind of have this vision that some guy maybe kind of has this paint, and he's going, he's just kind of adding an accent mark here and a letter there, and but that's that really did happen.
That's funny. So to get back to impressment, I'm guessing because it was necessary, there was something about this that was unappealing. This life. I don't know. I'm not going to speculate on what it was. I'll let you tell me. But there was something that people weren't, running to go join up.
Yes, no, that is correct. The fact that it was needed, right? And the name of my first book is The Evil Necessity. And I think that's how they thought about it, that, they almost acknowledged that this wasn't ideal, that this wasn't a great thing, but it was necessary. It was good for the promotion of the state and for the glory of Britain. But one thing I've said in different talks and presentations is that I've never found an example of a sailor who wanted to be impressed, and and maybe I should qualify that a little bit. Any white sailor that wanted to be impressed, because I have actually found a handful of black seamen, in this time, whether free or especially enslaved, where impressment was welcome, right? That this was an actual opportunity for people that were, so oppressed that they didn't have many other options. But for, a white English or even American sailor, they would do all kinds of things to avoid this, and especially change their dress, because, the clothes that sailors wore or the tar on their hands from working on the ship would be a dead giveaway that they were a sailor. And that's exactly what the press gang, was looking for in those bars and in other areas. And so sometimes this goes to extremes where some men even cross-dress at times in order to get away from the press gang. A couple of sailors I've found set up a fake law firm. They weren't sailors; they were lawyers. You can't.
That's fantastic.
Why are your hands so black?
Yeah.
That's right.
We write many contracts.
That's right. We write many contracts. That's the phrase I use, right? The ink-stained wretch. I'm just an ink-stained wretch. It's not tar. Yeah.
That's interesting that there are some that you had found some black sailors that were interested, that wanted to join up. I guess it speaks to the environment that working on a ship is. Like, you can't necessarily oppress a person in the same way,
right,
when you're out at sea and it's just a couple dozen of you. Actually, how many people would be on a ship? I actually have no idea.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, so it would get into the hundreds. Like the really, really large warships would have 500-600 men, which really distinguishes them from a merchant ship at the time. Merchant ships are much more like, almost always under 100 men and usually even a lot smaller than that. And the reason is they need all these extra men to man the cannons and to, basically fight. So when that's not happening, there's quite a bit of downtime. Even, in the military today, this is a common phrase, the hurry up and wait. There's a lot of waiting. And there was violent discipline, but I think you're correct. I think that's used, but that can only be used so far. I mean, I think that they had to use other motivations to get sailors to work. And one thing I write a lot about is just the sailors' ideals of their own manhood, their masculinity that was, really wrapped up in their professional skills. And so they get on a ship, and I think, this is what they did for a living. And even though they didn't want to be there and they didn't ask to be there, once they're there, there's that phrase, we're all in the same boat. They're going to keep the thing floating and moving, forward. They're not going to let it sink.
So sorry for the interruption, but we're going to take a brief break now for a word from our sponsors.
Yeah, I was going to say that there is something about a group of people going through, a tough work that creates cross-cultural or cross, social strata bonds. And I guess you couldn't avoid doing that if you're all doing the same work, essentially, and you're sort of on the same boat, like you said.
Yeah.
I like that. We're all in the same boat.
Yeah.
Is that where that comes from?
I think it is. All these phrases from the sailing world that you learn the ropes. That's
true. So a quick follow-up question to that, because I'm a person who likes my own space. When you say a big ship, 500 to 600 people, can you give us any idea of what big is or how much space? I mean, they obviously don't have their own rooms.
We're talking like
we're not a
cruise size.
Right.
Ship.
So what is a big ship at this time?
Yeah. So this is something that's called a ship of the line, like the largest ones that would have, 60, 70 cannon and, 3 masts. So if you kind of have an image in your head of, these kind of big warships, this is something that was very hard for, like, say, an upstart nation like the United States. They couldn't even make one of these things. I mean, it was really kind of like the biggest industrial practice at the time required to make this. And, it's very funny in Thomas Paine's Common Sense, when he's trying to convince the Americans to declare independence, and the very last section of that is all about how they can actually win this war against Britain. He has to confront the Royal Navy. Like, what are we going to do about the Royal Navy? And Thomas Paine's only real answer is, we have trees, we have forests in America. So it's like
we can make anything.
The potential is there, and of course,
they can't sail on the land.
That's right. That's right. What he doesn't say is it takes a couple of years to make one of these things, right?
So, you meant because of the wood. Okay.
Yeah.
I thought you meant he was implying like we'll just have to retreat to the hills.
Let's hide behind a tree.
That too. No, it works in all kinds of ways.
That makes slightly more sense. He was a little bit of a smarter guy than I'm giving him credit for.
Yeah, he's saying we'll make ships. Don't worry, but that doesn't happen until long into the 19th century. So. But these were really crowded spaces. The common sailors are living below deck and, very cramped conditions in which, they would maybe have, a hammock or a small space. So there isn't a lot of personal space for sure. And, for that reason, they might, when they climb up the mast and they're controlling the upper sails, which is really the hardest job they had, the most skilled work. You kind of think about it, they do have space. I mean, they kind of have a little bit of room up there, and it probably was
some alone time.
Maybe that's where breathing room comes from.
There you go.
We'll just make things up today.
Yeah, who knows?
It sounds good.
It could be.
Yes.
No sources.
That's right.
So you had mentioned about, how for some people, especially Black men, it could be, because it's only men, it could be sort of more freeing, or they might have more opportunities if they're impressed. Well, were enslaved people ever impressed? And how did that work? Because I'm sure there would be unhappy people if that was done.
Yeah. So this is a really interesting phenomenon. One thing I like to write about is something that I call the spectrum of free and unfree labor, that, impressment and these other practices like indentured servitude, slavery, that it's really fascinating when they come into contact with one another, when, say, an enslaved person comes into contact with impressment or vice versa. Because I think you can learn a little bit about these institutions and the way people at the time thought about them, and which one was preferable, which one was harsher, and all of that. And so impressed sailors, always refer to themselves as slaves in the 18th century, that they were, they'd been made into slaves. But then I find it really fascinating that the people that are actually enslaved want to be impressed. So I think that tells us that slavery is just, I think beyond the conditions of impressment. I mean, the thing about impressment, it did last the duration of a war, so there's no set time on it. And the French Revolutionary Napoleonic Wars, go on for like 20 years. So, it could be a very long time, but there is an end. And, there is like a point in which someone is freed. And so that was a really critical difference. And so I think for that reason, you can see the attraction for people who are enslaved. And so this is a long way I'll get back to your original question. In places like the Caribbean, or in some cases the American South, runaway slaves will, they'll run to the British Navy. And sometimes this causes real problems with, local populations, with plantation owners. Other times, like the Revolutionary War, the British forces, and even the War of 1812, the British forces are really forces of liberation. We think of them as Americans, we kind of think of them as the bad guys in all these things because of our movies like The Patriot. But for someone who's enslaved, they were the sign of hope. So it is really fascinating how these different systems of forced labor interacted with one another.
Yeah, there's actually a really interesting story that I only know because of the work on the George Washington series, but there's a ship called the HMS Savage, I believe, that landed the Potomac and threatened to burn down Mount Vernon, George Washington's house, for the listeners who who don't know. And Washington's cousin, who's managing the estate at the time, basically pays them off. But several enslaved people, Lynn, I'm forgetting the exact number, but is it like 9?
17.
17? Yeah.
17, that's correct.
Yeah, significant amount of people end up on the boat and leave. the plantation.
So this affected, George Washington. So this is a huge phenomenon during the war. Absolutely. And, and at the end of the war, the British transport, upwards of 20,000 African Americans to different parts of the British Empire. And, in a lot of places it didn't work out very well, but it did offer these people a different outcome than, the most likely outcome if they had stayed, especially in the American South.
So talking about the interaction between everybody, we've got the people who are impressed. They could be enslaved. They could be just people who, were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And then I imagine some people signed up willingly. So were there willing sailors, and how did they deal with these people who were forced there? I don't know if did they feel like they were above them, or, how was that? It's like, well, I did this willingly, and, they dragged you on board. So how did that work?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something I've spent a lot of time on trying to see the interactions between people who volunteer and people who are impressed. One really difficult thing is British naval records make it really hard for us to pinpoint the exact numbers for each. I think our best sort of working estimate is that it's about half and half for, say, your average 18th century war. Some wars, it might be closer to maybe like a third might be impressed. But over the course of the war, that number might increase so that by the end of the war, it might be around 2/3. But I guess the point is there's always large numbers of both impressed and volunteers. And I think it's interesting that they get along quite well. The impressed people really integrate into the crew. They're not trusted as much as you can imagine when they first come on board. They're not, they aren't given liberty to go on shore until they win the trust of the officers, and that's when they run away.
Right.
You would never see me again.
Just wait it out.
Right. And in some ways they really do kind of blur. And the records, the reason why they're not precise is that if a person is captured by a press gang, often the press gang, to kind of ease the transaction, you might say, offers something called the King's Bounty. This is what you get for volunteering. And if the impressed sailor accepts the bounty, he becomes recorded as a volunteer on the ship muster. And
like a signing bonus?
Yeah, kind of like a signing bonus. And I feel like that this was used
or like
quite
a plea
bit.
Deal.
Yes.
A plea deal.
It's like take the bounty. And this is in sort of like we were talking about the Elizabethan era. If we go way back then, this was called the King's Shilling. And there's a tradition associated with this where these recruiting gangs, for the Army and the Navy, but in this case, the Army would go to local bars. And there was an old saying that you would always want to drink out of a clear glass, like a pint glass, because they would, the recruiters would try to sneak the shilling into the glass, and if you drank it, you were in the Army.
Oh, you took it.
How often that
you actually swallow the coin? They're like, well, you accepted it.
Yeah.
You took it. You can't give it back.
It makes you wonder how often that actually happened. So this is how, someone who's captured gets called a volunteer. And the other weird dynamic, and this is something that I argue, and I tried to kind of shift the scholarship, the literature on this, is that one thing I argue is that press gangs are not just looking for any warm body, that they really want men that know how to sail, because this is a real skill at the time. And if you have too many landlubbers on the ship, it's not going to work. So they were really looking for skill. And so there's a lot of good evidence that shows that an impressed person comes on board and they actually advance faster in terms of, they have different ratings, the sailors do. And the top one is called able seamen. And so a higher percentage of impressed men are able seamen than they are, anything else, because those are the men that are the most desirable, and those are the ones that didn't want to volunteer. It's usually the ones that, didn't have maybe better options that want to sign up for a ship. So.
Right.
That kind of makes sense that they would be interested in sailors specifically, like just relating this to the film industry, because it's all sort of like a team's coming together for a very short period of time. Everyone needs to know, there's no time to like get to know each other and like develop a common language. Like you have to step on the set day one and understand the vernacular, understand what everyone is asking, understand the process and who's making what decisions, and all the titles are very specific for that reason. And I imagine it's kind of similar.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really terrific analogy. And we could probably think of, listeners, whatever industry you're in, you can kind of imagine that there's a certain amount of expertise that comes in whatever you might do. And to become an able seaman, you had to really be a sailor for usually at least 2 years. And, again, you had to know the ropes. you had to learn all the knots and how to steer and how to reef, and all the things that you did at the sail. And you're right. And so I think the Navy, how it benefits from that is they grab this person and they're ready to go. Right. They're ready to fight. And so this is a big question that I kind of pose. And that is, if impressment was so bad, why is the Royal Navy so successful? Why is it so good? And so this is my big spoiler alert, but the answer is impressment is that bad and the Navy's that good. So I think both things can be true, that impressment can be a real burden and something that sailors don't like. At the same time, the Navy can benefit from it, and that's why they did it.
So sorry for the interruption, but we're going to take a brief break now for a word from our sponsors. And it sounds like the press gangs are good. I wouldn't call them recruiters.
Headhunters?
They were good at choosing who to impress, I guess.
Yeah. And so they have a kind of a dual mission, to go back to your question a few minutes ago. They are supposed to accept volunteers as well. So they're kind of doing both things. Right. And they'll set up shop in a pub, and they'll call this their rendezvous. This is the press gang rendezvous site. And they'll put up the flag and they'll bang the drum and they'll put out posters and stuff. So they let people know that that's where they are so that they can get the volunteers. But then they'll send out their little bands of men to, go around to maybe other pubs, to other spots, and especially, like I said, at sea. And that's when they're going to do their pressing, when they're going to impress men. So they're doing both things.
Do they impress men from other ships? So if it's, say it's a Dutch ship and it captures a French ship, do they steal a bunch of French sailors, bring them on and make them learn Dutch?
In the Pirates of the Caribbean movies.
Yeah, so they're not supposed to. So there are laws that regulate this, and it's supposed to be only British sailors who are impressed. So first of all,
they can only grab their own citizens.
That's right.
Who don't want to be there.
Right. And this is why after the American Revolution, this becomes such a problem and such a controversy, because the British keep taking American sailors.
That's right.
After American independence. And what they say is, well, they have a couple of different arguments. So one is that once you're a subject of the king, that never ends. That doesn't go away. And they have a fancy title for this. It's called indefeasible allegiance or perpetual allegiance. And basically what it means is once a king's subject, always a king's subject. So they've never had a revolution, right? They've never had like a new country formed. So right after the American Revolution, they keep taking American sailors, and one of their arguments is, well, they were once British subjects, and they can't shed that. And eventually, once they come to the idea that okay, there are actually American citizens, their next excuse is, well, we can't tell the difference. They all speak English. They all look the same.
They all look the same.
And so it's really kind of like take men and ask questions later. And, and so the United States sets up this whole apparatus to try to free their own men from the British Navy. And they do, to the credit of the British government, they do release a fair percentage, but it takes a lot of effort, paperwork, and bureaucracy.
Of course,
which we love as historians. Bureaucracy equals primary documents, right?
Primary equals records. Yeah.
Yes. That's funny.
Yeah, that's why militaries, navies are good to study.
Oh, I know.
That makes sense as far as like the British conception of continually being a subject of the king. I mean, I guess because the fact that the Commonwealth exists. I mean, like the Queen or the King now, I guess, is on the money in like Canada and Australia, and I think Australia, by the way, in a bunch of other Commonwealth countries still to this day. I guess that idea perpetuated itself longer than after they acknowledged that America was like, okay, fine, you guys are separate.
Yeah, it's like they didn't know what to do with America. It's like they recognized American independence, but they're like, but that doesn't mean you're free of us. You're still
right. You're still stuck with us.
Yeah, you're still.
We'll let you have your independence, but you still have to,
still have to serve the king, right?
Serve on our ships forcibly. Yeah.
And so these same things that I talked about that affected British sailors, like if they took the bounty, they would be considered a volunteer. This happens to American sailors. So if their ship is stopped and a press gang comes on board and maybe that guy's feeling a little broke and, that bounty looks pretty good. He takes it. All of a sudden, he's stuck. There's no legal recourse at that point. He's considered a volunteer. He's not getting out, no matter how much lobbying the U.S. government does. This is a different time, different concerns.
Now, how did they? I'm always impressed. Actually, you mentioned record keeping, but I was
You're impressed, Isaac?
I am impressed. Oh, there you go. Does that come from that word too?
I don't think so. But
I'm trying to think of a way to connect it. Yeah, I'm trying to find a way to connect it, but I don't think I have anything. But even so, you said that it's to the end of the war. Some of these wars sort of like peter out without any sort of definable end. Or, certain things are like quasi wars that took place. How did they track someone's impressment or their volunteer term on a ship?
Yeah, when they get to be free or done.
Yeah, when they get to be free and done. And in a world where it could take like 6 months for someone else to find out that the war ended 6 months ago. They're on the other side of the planet.
Yeah. No, this is something that happens. Absolutely. So I guess the most famous case of this is, we call it the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars because there is this brief peace in 1802, lasts about a year before the war starts back up in 1803. So technically it's 2 wars, but they're so closely connected that we usually combine them. But at the time, the British Navy, as it did at the end of every war, it demobilized. So this is why they need the impressment in the first place. They don't have a large standing Navy because they don't want to pay people, during peacetime. Right. So they let everybody go, and then they have to impress everybody all over again. But during that time, ships that were off in the Caribbean or the Mediterranean or different places, they don't get the benefits of the peace. I mean, the sailors are very bitter that, one ship in particular, right when the peace is coming together, it's being sent out to the Caribbean and the guys are upset. And there's a little mutiny, they're like, come on, this is the end of the war. You can't be sending us to the other side of the world right now. This whole process, we circle back to piracy here because most pirates are born out of unemployment. Maybe that's even true today. Sense. You think about kids and stuff, kids that are bored or don't have something to do, or why crime happens. So what happens is all these sailors who have been impressed, they're made on, the war ends, they're out of a job.
Right.
And so what are they going to do? Well, a lot of them, especially in places like the Caribbean, they turn to piracy because that's when piracy happens mostly in peacetime. Which is interesting. I guess that's another way to think about the difference between pirates and privateers is during wartime, the smart pirate will get, the sanction from the government and become legal as a privateer.
So pirates are unemployed privateers.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah. See, things are happening on this podcast. We're creating knowledge here.
Yes.
Yeah. You're giving a bunch of people, training skills, a ship, to fund, they're funded, and then basically being like, all right, guys, war's done. Go back to whatever you were doing before.
And what are they qualified to do? Be a pirate.
Sail a ship.
Yeah. And so it's like the only thing worse than being forced to work and have this job is once you actually do that, to be thrown out of the job because at least they were getting paid. And that's another difference of slavery. I mean, it's not a great wage, but they were happy to get the money.
Oh, this is I guess a little bit of a stretch, but a modern day analogy that just popped into my head is actually a little bit like the Mujahideen fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan in the 80s, right? This is a group of people that were, willing to fight, being funded by one government. And then, after that government was like, all right, we're done. Those guys didn't go home.
Right.
Like, they didn't just leave. They organized and started getting resources from other places and kept fighting, essentially, because that's what they had been set up to do.
Yeah,
It's really it's not surprising at all that that the piracy happened in peacetime.
Yeah, and there's and I think you see these patterns in history that sometimes the most dangerous thing in history is like an army that doesn't have anything to do, right? So so this is kind of the phenomenon at the end of the Revolutionary War when the American army is no longer fighting, the British, and this is when you get the Newburgh conspiracy, and all of a sudden, the army's going to possibly turn on its own government, and this is why way back in sort of the English tradition, there was a lot of fear of standing armies, and that this was not a good thing. And this is one reason why I think, at least ideologically, the British veered towards the Navy. It also made sense as an island nation, but the Navy seems like a safer thing. The ships are off at sea, and they're not going to bother anybody for the most part, and so impressment is kind of the sort of ugly price for all of this. And it affects an underclass that a lot of, more elite members of English society don't really care about or don't really see. And so it seems to be a very convenient solution for, their ideological hangups and their defense needs and everything else.
Yeah, it's definitely safer. Like Thomas Paine said, you can't sail in the forest, right?
That's right.
What are they going to
That's
do?
right. If you read between the lines, that's exactly what he was saying.
But that's that's actually the out of sight, out of mind idea. It's like, it makes sense. You have a big standing army, where are you going to quarter them in people's houses and stuff?
Right.
Like, you got to put them somewhere. And they're like, off of a boat somewhere far away, all sleeping basically on top of each other.
That's like a floating jail.
So how did this era of impressment come to a close? Like, did this end in any real, solitary fashion? Or does this sort of just fall out of fashion over time, or do they pass a law that makes it illegal? Or
yeah, it kind of peters out. So America, eventually goes to war over this. In 1812, they declare war, and it's a war for a lot of reasons. But I think I argue that impressment is right at the top of the list. And so they're fighting the British over this. It seems like a good idea until the war goes very poorly. No matter how many times America tries, they can never conquer Canada. This goes back to the Revolutionary War.
We'll
don't
get
invade
them eventually.
Yes, that's right. Don't invade Russia, in European history, and don't invade Canada in North American history. But it seems like a good idea. And then the British burn, the capital in August of 1814, and it gets real. And all of a sudden, this war over impressment doesn't seem like a very good idea. And so the Americans pursue peace at that point, and that coincides right with the time when the British, defeat Napoleon for the first time, and then after the Battle of Waterloo for the second time. And so the Napoleonic Wars come to an end by 1815, and nobody knows it at the time because they don't have they're not fortune tellers, they don't have the crystal ball. But impressment would never be necessary again for the British. There's the Pax Britannica, this sort of period of peace in the 19th century with Britain as the main superpower. And one part of that is there's not a lot of wars until the end of the century. There's the Crimean War in 1857, and that's kind of a test case. And the British almost impressed sailors, but by that point they've kind of gotten a reserve naval system figured out. So it just kind of goes away. And, but of course we have modern day analogs. So, the draft and other forms of conscription, they're a little bit less ad hoc and hopefully less violent than impressment. But we to this day, we still see conscription around the world. So that's sort of the quick end of it.
So I always love to talk about sources, and we mentioned military history. You have everything written down. You have records. Do you have have you found any firsthand accounts or maybe diaries written by people who were on these ships, or letters maybe they wrote home? Just sort of their perspective of any of this.
Yeah, and it's so exciting every time you get one because there isn't a super high literacy rate among sailors of this era, and there's all these natural forces that are working against these primary sources, right? Especially water damage. But given that, there's a surprising number, and especially a lot that are produced actually out of the controversy of the problem of impressing Americans, because once those sailors are captured, it really does become an effort to try to amass as much evidence as possible that they're actually U.S. citizens. So they're writing home, they're writing to consuls in Britain and to whoever they can to get help. And if a sailor can't write, and this is a really common thing, there's somebody on the ship that can. So there'll be one person that will, write a lot of letters on behalf of different people on a ship. And in this respect, it's kind of interesting. The British allow mail. This wasn't, something that was generally confiscated. That they, to their credit, they allowed letters to go back and forth. So an impressed sailor. The handful that we have that did write, in some cases we have multiple letters back and forth to home. And, there's some kind of just basic language that's common to all of them that, I've never been in such a sorry state, that I'm miserable. And you really do kind of feel, you're reading this and you're like, oh my gosh, these guys, this is really a tough thing. Most of them that we have letters for, or a lot of them, do turn out to be positive in the end, so we can kind of appreciate that process. But of course, lots of them perish, and all kinds of bad things happen.
And for those of us who like minutia, how did the mail come back and forth? Was there like a little tugboat that came by, dropped off a sack of mail, picked it up, and went back?
I don't think there was a rowboat sailing across the Atlantic then. just one dude.
I said tugboat.
Just paddling with just a sack of letters.
Well, how do you know where they are?
Like the worst job ever,
you don't have the radar and everything, so.
That's such a good question, and I should know more about that. And there is a whole process at different ports for how it worked, and I think it really is. Makes sense. There is kind of like, I don't think they called it a mail boat, but there is like mail will be put on top of a part of the cargo of, say, a merchant ship. And I think there was this kind of understanding that when you arrived to a port, there was a person you gave it to, and it gets distributed. And one of the really sad things in reading this is some of these sailors who are waiting to get that evidence that of their citizenship or something like that. The ship just leaves at a certain point, and then the letter will come, and they won't get it until months, sometimes years later, and it's just like so
like, I told you so.
Yeah. And I feel as historians, we have this amazing power where we're, examining these lives, that we have these tools and that we can see things happening to them that, they couldn't see in real time. And of course, someday somebody will be analyzing us probably in the same way.
I hope we're interesting enough.
Yes.
Somebody wants to analyze us.
Well, this podcast will make it will endure. It'll endure.
So normally I actually talk for a lot of our guests. We are always, one of the things that I end up saying repetitively over and over again is that you're usually, no matter where you're listening to this, you're usually within like 30 minutes drive of something historically cool that you can go check out that you probably don't know exists, like a little historical house or something along those lines. Obviously, this is a little different because it's, ships rather. But are there any cool places that people could visit to experience some of, like, whether there's a ship or like, hey, there's a museum dedicated to this particular subject, or if they were interested to pursue further interest?
Yeah, that's such a good question, and just a few things pop into my head. I mean, I think anybody who lives near the waterfront, if you have, say in Boston or something, I mean, impressment would happen, right there on the wharf. And we have, in DC, there's impressment doesn't necessarily happen here, but we have the naval yard, so we still have this sort of legacy, the Alexandria waterfront, and any place like that where they have these ships. If you get a chance to just go on board one of these, I mean, they really are beautiful and incredible how they were made. And you do get kind of a sense from walking around them, how these things were made. And so, very famous ones, going back to Boston, like the USS Constitution, Old Ironsides. And then there's other legacies of this era that are kind of fun. So if you do make it to Washington and you make it to the Smithsonian Museum of American History, they have the original Star-Spangled Banner. And of course, our national anthem is born of this war caused by impressment, even though we don't always think of it that way. So yeah, I think this is around us. And I like to think that, this did produce a lot of talk about rights and liberties and all of these things. I think in the history of ideas do kind of build on each other and I think do kind of affect who we are today as a nation. That America first defined itself as a place of volunteer forces, that that they weren't going to have armies or navies that were forced into service like the armies of Europe. And of course, the United States eventually did do that with conscription, but at least at that founding moment, that's kind of what they're defining themselves against, I think is still really important.
Do you think if there's one movie that we could watch that would give us the most realistic, I'm not saying realistic, but the most realistic?
I have a guess.
Okay,
and
I'll try.
I have one in my head too.
Yeah, but I'll let you answer first because I hear this from people all the time.
All right, here we go.
Yeah, that you think is the most accurate representation of what you're talking about and the life at sea.
All right. Muppet Treasure Island.
I knew it.
Yes.
Not what I was thinking.
No, I was going to. Okay, so if that's not the one, I would say Master and Commander.
That's the one I had.
Everyone always has Master and Commander. Every person who's into naval history is like, that's the movie.
It's an unbelievable film. Like if you study this stuff and you look at the records, I mean, it is a really, really excellent application of that to film. And, I show this I have a graduate seminar in the British Atlantic world. And I had one student once in the middle of the film, he says, nothing really happens in this movie. And I said, I think that's why it's so great. It kind of like gives you this actual feel of what it's like to be on one of these ships. So that's
fantastic. That's the one I was thinking.
Well, that's great. So, Deborah, is there any place where our listeners can go and find you or find your work? Are you posting? I know that history, social media right now is a little bit in a shifting landscape. But are you on Twitter? Are you on Mastodon? Are you on I don't even know what the other ones are called now, or Facebook?
Yeah,
Instagram.
I'm not super active on social media, so it's good that you guys found me in my office today, and I can get out and talk to the people. So,
great.
But I do lots of public talks. I do talks at Mount Vernon. I do talks for an organization in Washington D.C. called Profs and Pints, I'm known to answer an old-fashioned email. So I love sharing ideas with folks, and as you say, maybe when the social media landscape, settles here, maybe I'll jump in.
Yeah. Well, and for any listeners who are interested, we'll have a link to Denver's published work and stuff, so you can take a look at that, and some links to some of his papers regarding this particular subject that are publicly available. But Denver, thank you so much for being part of this. This was a super fun conversation.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, this was great.
Thank you for listening to the full episode of Too Complicated for History. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and if you did, please leave us a review on Odyssey, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to follow us on our social media platforms at 2C4H_podcast, or check out the link in the description. This will keep you in the loop for show updates, new episodes, and exclusive content.
Too Complicated for History is a podcast from Primary Source Media, produced by Patrick Long and Lynn Price Robbins, edited and mixed by Curtis Fritsch, opening theme music by Sheena Biratella.